how GPS changed everything. I'm not going to tell you, all the different ways that GPS changed everything. What I wanted to focus on is the how, like what about GPS changed our lives. So many of you look like you used paper maps at one time, like I did, to get around, right? In the days before cell phones and things like that. And that's just the most obvious thing. But GPS has really changed so many aspects of our lives. I've been working in GPS since 1985. I had a choice. I was an intern at Hughes Space and Comm. It's now part of Boeing. And I had a choice of 3 different projects to work on in the summer. One of them was GPS for the space station at that time, not the International Space Station, the older version of the space station. So I thought, oh, that sounds cool. I'll pick that one. And when I went on to grad school, so I did my master's thesis on GPS for the space station. And then I went to grad school and I was really sick of GPS and I never wanted to see those 3 letters together again. But I was trying to get paid to go to grad school. And one of the professors there was Brad Parkinson, who is the father of GPS. He is the man who in the Air Force really made GPS happen. And he was looking for someone to work on GPS, and I wanted to do interplanetary trajectories. But he convinced me, he said, well, we'll let you do, you'll have an opportunity to work on orbits and GPS. And so I agreed. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made because I thought I knew a lot about it at that time. But what I didn't realize is how huge it is. There's almost no subject you can think of that doesn't have some bearing on GPS. And so that's been really fascinating. And throughout my career, I've worked on a number of different things adjacent to it, but really GPS has been a guiding light for almost everything I do. So it's been really interesting. Have you guys seen the movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding? Okay, so there's that scene where he says, tell me a word and I'll tell you why it's actually Greek, right? So I always feel like that about GPS, like come up with something you think that's not related to GPS and you can challenge me at the end and I'll tell you why it actually is, okay? So the scope of things I thought I would talk about are answering these questions. So how does GPS work? This is not, I gave a lecture earlier for the physics colloquium. This is not that lecture. So I wanted to talk about the fundamentals of how GPS works so each of you feels like you understand it. Can I speak louder? I can up the speaker volume. Is that better? How's that? Any better? More? Okay, I can make you all sit in the front row. Okay, we'll try that. Is that okay? I don't know. At some point it's going to echo. Okay? So. All right. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to do that. Is that going to hurt people's ears though? It's too echoey. Okay. All right, we'll try it. How many people like this volume? How many people dislike this volume? Yeah, me too. Sorry, I grew up in New York, so I have to remember to tone that down a little bit, and I'll try to speak slower. That might help too. How about? Okay. So we'll start with how GPS works, a little bit of history and just the fundamentals of what happens when it's telling you where you're located, how that actually comes to be. I'll then talk about the features of it, like what is it about it? What's the root thing that makes it so amazingly useful? Because it really transformed not only positioning and timing, but it created scientific opportunities that nobody anticipated it would do. So I'll talk about why that is. And then I'll show you some of those science applications and you'll go, can GPS really do that? And then we'll talk somewhat about the risks and threats to GPS as a utility. You hear about that in the news a lot, how GPS is vulnerable and how all these problems with it. So I kind of want to set the record straight on some of those. And then I'll give you my prediction of what the GPS of the future looks like with the caveat that I'm not very good at predicting the future. So, feel free to ask questions. I think we're going to save most of them till the end. But if you have a burning question, you could raise your hand and I'll try to answer, okay? All right, this is classic GPS. This is an early picture from the Air Force of what GPS is about. It consists of 3 segments. A space segment, those are the satellites that transmit the signals. It has a control segment. Actually, I don't think I can use the mouse, right? Yeah, it has a control segment that consists of monitoring stations around the world that listen to the satellites and decide what needs to be uploaded to them. And then there's a bunch of 18 to 20-year-olds who sit in a room in Colorado Springs who press the button to upload stuff to the satellites in the air at Peterson Air Force Base, Schriever Air Force Base. And then there's the user segment, which they show here as a fighter jet, but basically that's everybody who uses GPS. Billions of people now who use GPS. All of those are the user segment. The dates are 1978. So GPS was first initiated as a real program in 1973. That's when it really got started. In 1978, the first GPS satellite was launched. In 1983, President Reagan offered it to the world for free indefinitely. And in 1993 was the time when it first became a full positioning system. It was fully capable in 1993. Okay, and you could use it before that, but it wasn't sort of full up and running until that time. So it's kind of new in the scheme of things, really. But it's also, I think this year, experiencing its 50th anniversary, something like that, of when it first sort of got started, which is a big deal. So just a little bit of history on it. So GPS is the global positioning system. So it's a satellite-based global navigation system. But it's not the first satellite navigation system. The first satellite navigation system was actually transit, which is based on Doppler. It came about very shortly after Sputnik. So Sputnik was, famous Russian satellite, first one launched. Sputnik was putting out a beep tone, a tone, and people at Johns Hopkins figured out that from that tone, from measuring the Doppler of that signal, they could figure out where the satellite was. And folks at Johns Hopkins figured out, well, if you can do that, then if you know where you are, if you know where you are, if you know where the satellite orbit is, you can figure out where you are. Okay, so they figured out how to turn Sputnik's signal upside down, essentially. And transit was a system that was developed primarily for positioning of submarines, right? So they would be out, or ships out in the ocean, and they would just track one satellite at a time, and they were able to do positioning. So the first satellite system was in like 1958, really is 1959 timeframe, they first started it. And GPS is also not the first global navigation system, surprisingly. There's a system called Omega, which is the first global radio navigation system. It consisted of 8 stations around the world, and they transmitted very low frequency signals, 10 megahertz signals, way below anything that we listen to on the radio, much below anything that we use for GPS. But it's such a low frequency signal that it can travel along the surface of the Earth, and it was able to cover the entire Earth with these 8 stations. It's very inconvenient. The antennas are huge, and you don't get very rapid updates, okay? So not useful for cell phones whatsoever, but it was the first global navigation system. And there were other ones that came in between that were more regional. But GPS, Global Positioning System, is the first satellite-based global navigation system. You can use it anywhere in the world, 24/7, horrible weather. It can be snowing, it can be ice pellets, it can be foggy in the middle of the night, and you could be in the middle of the desert, and you can use it just as well as you can outside on a sunny day. So it was really designed to be able to be positioning anywhere, anytime. So what did this early GPS equipment look like? 1978 version of the ManPack. This was the portable soldier-mounted GPS unit, not looking too much like our cell phones today, but that's what the initial things looked like. Wasn't particularly convenient, but it did demonstrate that with something like this, you could be completely by yourself in the middle of nowhere and figure out where you are. It would determine where you are without any other information. And that was really transformational. What does GPS user segment look like now? It's all over the map, okay? There are so many different types of applications. I'm sorry for that thing that's blocking the top picture, the titles. Sorry about that. This says Global Navigation Satellite System users today, okay? So how many people use GPS to get here this morning or this afternoon? Okay, yeah, of course. let me tell you about the title first. So GPS, satellite navigation system, a tool looking for a problem. This is a quote from one of my early proposals being rejected by the National Science Foundation, who objected to the idea that I was pitching a proposal to use GPS for all kinds of different things. It wasn't science focused enough. It wasn't like, here's a science problem I want to solve, here's the method I'm going to solve it. It was really like, hey, GPS is cool, we can use it for all kinds of stuff. Okay, so they didn't like that, but I do. So it turns out you can use it for all kinds of stuff. So you can use GPS for positioning, you can use it in your cell phones now, you can use it for tracking wildlife. You can track things much smaller than manatees. You can even track birds nowadays with tiny little GPS chipsets. You can use GPS to synchronize the power grid because all of the positioning in GPS is based on timing. It's sort of baked into it. So you can use it for that. You can use it for sensing ionospheric activity and landing airplanes and surveying. You know, we ever see surveyors out there with the poles with the GPS antennas on top? Surprisingly, that was one of the earliest applications of GPS because when you do surveying, you don't necessarily need to do it 24/7. You could do it in the early days of GPS before all the satellites were up there, just a few of them. You could still do surveying in those days. You can also do things like fly drones in urban environments and synchronize ATMs. And then you can also fly satellites with GPS. So GPS satellites are high enough up that they're used for determining the orbits of most of the other satellites that we use nowadays too. So it really has been great. A friend of mine described GPS as spectrum dumping because what the satellites do is they sit up there in orbit, they bathe the Earth with these signals all the time, right? So the Earth is not only illuminated by the sun now, but it's also illuminated by lots and lots of GPS satellites. And they're sending out signals that are in the L band. And those signals not only allow you to position, but in the process of getting to you, they also are probing the environment. And so people have figured out how to use those signals for other stuff because they're out there all the time for free, right? It's not a service you pay for. I mean, we pay for it with our tax dollars, but the satellite signals are up there all the time. So people have been so creative in coming up with new things that can be done with these signals. So it's super cool. All right, here's the part where I tell you why I'm not a good predictor of the future. So first GPS satellite launched in 1978. I was a graduate student in the mid-80s, and I came across this paper called Civil GPS from a Future Perspective. It was in the IEEE Proceedings, the prestigious journal. It was written by a man named Tom Stansel, who was involved in the early design of GPS. And he said a bunch of interesting things, but in particular, the very concept of being lost may cease to have much meaning or come to mean that your navigation equipment stopped working. Okay? And I thought that is the stupidest thing I ever heard. Right? Because you look at a map, you know how to go, you figure out where the stars are. How could that possibly be? How could we be so dependent on it? Well, of course we are, and he was totally right, right? We don't get lost except when we can't use GPS. So I thought, looking back on this, how much foresight this gentleman had about how the world was going to change with this. And I certainly did not at the time. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of it. I thought now we would talk about exactly how does GPS positioning work. How many people would like to know this? Like, how many people are not really sure? Okay, cool. So I need volunteers. You just raised your hand, so you're volunteering. I need one volunteer first, and I'm going to switch the camera view so you guys on the webinar can see it too. Okay, all right. So let me get one volunteer first. Okay, you can come down, Esther. I need two, actually. I can call on her because she was in my class last year. Okay. What's your name?
Richard.
Richard, here you go. So you can be the satellite.
Oh.
Okay. Nice. So the satellites have solar panels, so we'll make Richard stand like this the whole time. Not really. Okay. And Esther, you're going to be the user, the receiver. So you put your finger through the loop and you hold it. So Esther's the user. she's tracking a signal transmitted by Richard, right? And so if Richard, we're going to pretend is a, satellite standing still, not moving. And Esther's trying to figure out where she is. So she can measure the distance to the satellite. So why don't you show us all the places you could be when you measure this distance? And it has to stay tight, right? Because light travels in a straight line. Well, why are you holding it level? You could be up here too, right? Okay, how about lower down? See, this is why I made her be the receiver. So, okay, so she can be in any of these locations. What kind of a surface do we know that she must be on? Sphere, right? She could be all the way up there if she could jump high enough, right? She can be anywhere on a sphere that's that distance from the satellite, right? So, okay, that's nice, but it doesn't tell us where we are. So what do we need? You can just yell out. We need another satellite, right? Okay. The receiver, same antenna picks up both of them. I need another satellite volunteer. Come on. Oh, you weren't volunteering? All right. You're going to be a satellite over here. And actually, I'm going to stand as far back here as you can go. Okay, so Esther now with her antenna has to track both satellites at the same time, right? So where could she be now? Actually, you know what? I'm going to have you come a little bit more this way. So she has a more, perfect, thank you. Okay, so where can she be? Yep, go all the way down there. Okay, and now reach up as high as you can. Go across to the other side. Thank you. Keep all the way down. You got to go down too. Okay, so where could she be? It's on a circle that's the intersection of those two bubbles, right? So if you imagine two bubbles, let's move a little closer so she can actually touch the ground a little bit. There you go. Okay, so right? So she's anywhere on a circle that of the intersection of those two bubbles. Now, if Esther was on a ship, she would have enough information to know where she is because she'd also know she's on the surface of the earth and not flying around in the sky. But if she's an airplane or a satellite, she doesn't know. So what do we need? You know. Can I get somebody back here? Okay, you can stay where you are, you might have to stand up. Uh-oh. Oh, it's not quite, can you get over here? I'm sorry, you have to move. Okay. Same antenna. Okay, so the problem with this is, so it kind of looks like she sort of knows where she is, but she can still move her hands up and down quite a bit, right? And that's because this is a terrible geometry, because all the satellites are flat in one plane. So I need a tall person to raise their satellite up and another person to go down. And you see how if they're in different heights, it constrains where she is pretty nicely. And if we were lucky enough to have a hovering satellite above, the geometry would, I won't make anybody do that. The geometry would then be really good and it would nail where she's located. Does that make sense? Okay, so thank you all. Perfect. You did great. Thank you. I'm just going to ball this up because I can never get that from one program to another. Okay. All right. So let's see. So the thing is, how does she actually measure the distance to those satellites? There's no strings hanging down, right? The way we measure it is with time. So you can imagine that each satellite is a digital clock in space that's showing you what time it is, okay? You look at it with your eye, and the light takes a certain amount of time to get from the satellite to you, right? Light travels at 300,000 kilometers per second, 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. And so it takes just under 1,000th of a second for light to get from the satellite to the receiver. And it's not really light, it's a radio signal, but the radio signals travel at the same speed of light. So the signals are traveling from the satellite to us at that high speed. And what we do in the receiver is we track what time it arrived. So the satellite tells us the time that it left, and the receiver measures what time it arrived. Difference is those two numbers multiplies by speed of light, and that's the distance. That's the length of the string. Make sense? What's wrong with that? Light travels really fast. So if I was off by 1 millisecond, if I'm off by 1,000th of a second, I'm going to make an error of 300 kilometers. And that's pretty lousy, right? We want to know where we are better than that. So what are we going to do? What we do is we have a fourth satellite. Okay. So instead of only tracking 3 satellites to determine our position, we track 4 satellites and we solve for not only our position, but how far off our clock is. Okay. And if we know how far off our clock is, we can then actually correct it so that it's right. And that's why GPS is so useful for synchronizing time as well as positioning. Does that make sense? Okay. So, all right. So, okay, so there's satellites, the geometry matters. In order to position anywhere on the Earth, any time of day, you have to see at least 4 at a time. So unlike Starlink or other communication satellites, we only need to see 1 at a time. To position, you've got to see 4. So that means the people providing GPS have to put up enough satellites so that no matter where you are on the Earth, you can see at least 4 of them at a time. And this is what we currently have. So what is GNSS? GPS, the Global Positioning System, is the US system for doing this. And it was the first one. But in the meantime, a bunch of other countries and the European Union put up additional systems, not just like GPS, very similar to GPS. So during the Cold War, the Russians, the Soviets, put up GLONASS, the Russian or the Soviet version of GPS, very similar to what GPS was like, not surprisingly, right? Since then, the European Union has launched Galileo, China has launched Beidou, and then there are a bunch of other augmentations or additions to these global systems. To position anywhere on the Earth, you don't need all of them. You only need one. Like you could do it just with GPS, you could do it just with GLONASS, you could do it just with Beidou, just with Galileo. Why do you think there's so many different ones? Politics, totally politics, because other countries don't trust the US military to not shut it off or do something, which is, not a bad calculation, right? I mean, there's no plans to do that, but if you're a sovereign country or European Union, it makes sense, right? The other thing that they did too is GPS is kind of old. Beidou is pretty new. So when they started putting together the Chinese Beidou system, it didn't have all the legacy stuff. So they could introduce new ideas and new technologies much more quickly than we could in GPS because we had to keep things backward compatible. So it's actually interesting because the US was not too keen on the whole idea of these other ones coming to be, but in fact, it really propelled GPS to advance and create new technologies and integrate better signals and things like that. So it actually turned out to be good for everybody. And then on top of that, there's been agreements through the United Nations for the systems to be compatible. They're not identical, but your cell phone actually can use all of them, okay, with the same chip in your cell phone. Okay, so a little bit more about what the satellite constellations look like and where the satellites are. These are the different orbits that the GPS satellites, or GNSS. So GNSS is sort of the generic name for all of them combined, right? These are the different types of orbits, and this picture is to scale, except for the satellite. So the Earth is about, is the reference size. Low Earth orbit is the purple ring, and the red is what's called medium Earth orbit. And they put the GPS and all the other constellations have their satellites in medium Earth orbit, not low Earth orbit and not geosynchronous orbit. So satellites are your dish satellites that you point your dish on your house to pick up signals, and they stay fixed in the sky. Low Earth orbit satellites are the ones that do a lot of communications, like Starlink is a low Earth orbit constellation. And all the navigation satellites are in this medium orbit. That means they take like 8 or 10 hours to move across the sky pretty slowly. They're hard to shoot down because they're way up there. So that was one of those political things. And they can get much better coverage of the Earth with a single antenna from that higher vantage point than you can from low Earth orbit. In low Earth orbit, you need lots more satellites. And when they were thinking about putting GPS up, you can cover the whole Earth so that everybody sees 4 satellites with only 24 satellites in orbit. If you try to do that from LEO, from low Earth orbit, you need hundreds of satellites, which at the time everyone thought was ridiculous. But of course now it's happening, right? Elon Musk and other people are putting up hundreds of satellites all the time. They're going to have thousands of low Earth orbit satellites. So when we talk about the future of GNSS, that's something that's now feasible that when GPS was created was complete non-starter, right? When I started working on GPS, if you had said, oh, you need 1,000 satellites to get this to work well, or 400 satellites, everybody would have said, well, that's never going to happen, right? But that whole calculation changed since then. Okay, so we're in medium Earth orbit. What does this mean for you? When you turn on your phone to get directions to come here, it looks out into the, it doesn't have to do anything besides listen. So GPS is a totally passive system. Your phone does not transmit a thing in order to use GPS. It just listens, like when you turn on the radio in your house, right? So when you turn on your GPS, it listens to all the satellites that are in the sky sending GPS signals. These are all the satellites in the sky at 1 o'clock today here in Boulder, okay? So they're colored differently. GPS are the green ones, GLONASS, Galileo, et cetera. There's enough GPSs up there so that you could position with just GPS. But anytime you use GPS, you sort of see all these satellites in the sky. Each of them is sending out a signal like that string, and your phone or your other kind of GPS receiver is figuring out the intersection of all those different possibilities and coming up with your location. Does that make sense? Those yellow lines, or the different lines, show the direction those satellites are going to move over time. So the time it's shown right now is exactly for 1 o'clock local time, and then they move across the sky. What do you notice about that picture? There's a hole at the top. So there's a hole towards the North Pole, right? So I'm sorry, I didn't tell you what the picture is. The picture is a sky plot. If you look up at the sky, the center of that picture is directly overhead, and the low on the horizon is to the north at the top, and then low on the horizon to the south is at the bottom. So imagine just looking up at the sky, that's what you would see. And the farther out they are in the picture means the lower they are in the sky, okay? So if you're in Boulder, you can see quite a few satellites directly overhead or close to overhead. And then you can see satellites to the east and satellites to the west and satellites to the south that are sort of low in the sky, but you don't see any low in the sky to the north. That just has to do with the orbit planes, how the satellites are in their orbits, okay? But as long as the satellites that you pick up are sort of in very different directions, like we saw with the high one, the low one, you get good position answers because it really nails down where you're located. So anywhere on Earth, you can see this sort of picture. If you're at the North Pole, it looks a little different, right? At the North Pole, that hole has moved to be directly overhead. So at the North Pole, people working in the Arctic or high latitudes never see GPSs directly overhead, but they have more satellites out around them. So their vertical positions can be a little bit worse, but their horizontal positions are actually better, okay? Sometimes you'll read in the media where people say, GPS doesn't work in high latitudes because somebody looks at this picture and thinks it means you can't do it, right? But you can do it because you still got plenty of satellites. You're looking for that intersection, so you're good. So you can use it anywhere. Good? Okay. All right. So the thing that the GPS satellites send are a whole bunch of complicated signals. They're called spread spectrum signals. And what this does is it allows all the GPS satellites to transmit on the same radio station. So imagine you're tuning into GPS, same radio station, all the satellites can talk at the same time without it sounding like garbage because they have this special coding on, not coating, but coding, encoding, that allows the signals to not interfere with each other. So it allows something called CDMA, code division multiple access. And that's beautiful because they can all transmit at the same frequency without interfering with each other. Okay. What your receiver actually tracks then, it produces, are several different types of measurements. It produces those ranging measurements, the string lengths. It measures also the carrier signals, like the sine waves that carry the radio signals or carry the information. And then it can also measure signal power. So those three things are what your receiver is measuring. And just to give you a picture of what the measurements look like, if you look at that top picture, if you're here on the Earth and you track a satellite over the time when it crosses the sky, what you see is that sort of almost parabola shape, right? The signal is farther away when it first rises. It gets shorter as it comes higher in the sky, and then it gets longer again as it sets. So that's a really typical pattern like this. The two different types of measurements, the pseudo-range measurements, which are those range measurements, are kind of noisy, and the carrier measurements are very smooth and quiet, very precise. And so GPS applications, some of them use code, some of them use pseudo-range, some of them use phase, and they can produce all kinds of different stuff with it. Okay. So let's talk about, so there's all these different positioning techniques. The official original system was designed so you could position anywhere completely on your own, right? But with your cell phone, actually the cell tower is providing a lot of information to the phone. It's gathering some extra information, makes it easier for your phone to do positioning with less power. So that's one of the new things that has happened. The other interesting thing that happened that I think is part of what makes GPS change the world is not only have these constellations been put up there, but there's this voluntary organization, international organization called the International GNSS Service. They put GPS receivers all over the world. Every country has their own, and they collect data with these really high precision receivers, and they put that data out on the internet for free. And they collect it every single day for years and years and years. And this created this giant scientific trove of data. So when you want to study something like what's going on in the ionosphere near Antarctica, you don't have to go to Antarctica and collect your own data. You just tap into this giant database. And so not only do we have satellites bathing the Earth, we also have ground stations providing information free for anyone who wants to use it to study. So that's been a humongous impact on scientific advancement because people could explore things without having all the resources themselves. So I feel like this is an equally transformational contribution. I would call this the real World Wide Web, right? It's not a fake World Wide Web. This is a real World Wide Web where we have satellites transmitting signals all over. We have receivers receiving stuff all over the world. And the interaction between those two things is allowing us to really explore our environment and Earth's surface and in ways that, again, never intended for this. So I have some examples here. This is, what would I call, can GPS really do that? So here's a list of science applications that have come about through GPS. People have measured earthquakes through the motion of the ground, so a receiver on the ground measuring the earthquake, ice sheet motion in Greenland, time variable gravity. So gravity changes when water moves around on the Earth. So GPS has contributed to our measurement of that. They've measured relativistic effects on clocks on the satellites themselves, ionospheric activity, space weather, you've probably heard about, atmospheric profiles, and then even things like snow depths and vegetation and ocean surface winds. So let me just show you a few examples of this, and then I'll give you a chance to ask some questions. Actually, yeah, sorry, I'm running along a little longer. Should I skip ahead to the other things or leave more time for questions? Okay. So ocean surface topography is really important for measuring sea surface height. It's the effects of climate change. You see a picture on the right is an example. This was one of the earliest applications of using GPS in space, is measuring the orbit and how it's affected by gravity. And you could see from this the change in the sea level using a combination of the orbit information, which comes from GPS, and then an altimeter that measures the height of the satellite above the ocean surface. And you have a record that goes back to like 1992 to today, all based on GPS plus these altimeter measurements. As the signals travel through the ionosphere, they're affected by it. And it turns out it's such an important effect that the GNSS satellites transmit several different frequencies because each one is affected differently. And then when you use a combination of them, you can actually measure what's going on in the ionosphere and either get rid of it or study the ionosphere. And so you can use this to detect what's going on in terms of space weather. And it's one of important resource for doing that, because you can do something like tomography, like what's done in brain scans. You can do that with the Earth's ionosphere, with all these different GPS signals. You can also track GPS signals from low Earth orbit. So instead of looking up at them, you can track them as they set through the Earth's atmosphere, right? So here we have a low Earth orbit satellite that's tracking a GPS signal that's actually being bent as it goes through the Earth's atmosphere. And that gives you a measure of the density and temperature. You can invert it to find density and temperature of the atmosphere. And that's used in our numerical weather prediction models that give our weather forecasts. Okay, what about things reflecting off the Earth? So GPS signals bathe the Earth. They also bounce off the Earth, and that causes problems for positioning. It can make your positioning less accurate. But it turns out that if you take an antenna and if you point it down at those reflections, you can actually sense things about the Earth's surface with it. So you can sense whether the Earth, things like this, you can see ocean surface winds. So ocean surface winds make the ocean surface more rough. That changes how the GPS signals reflect off the ocean. When they come off of a smooth surface, they look sharp. When they come off a rough surface, they're sort of spread out differently. They're delayed across a different spectrum. And by looking at that spread, you can infer what the ocean surface roughness is, and then from that, what the ocean surface winds must have been. You can also see the difference between here in this tide gauge picture. Here's a picture of a GPS antenna on the shore next to a place where the tides are very high. This is in Alaska. So you see this, there's like a tripod here with an antenna on top of it. Here's low tide, here's high tide. When this antenna here is tracking GPS signals that are out in front of it, when the tide is low, the reflections come in, and there's a different beat pattern of those reflections when this tide is high versus low. And from that, they can measure ocean tides to like a centimeter. It's amazing. Okay, and then here's the most ridiculous one of all, I think. You can measure soil moisture, because when the signals reflect off of soil, right, the amount of water content in it affects the reflectivity of the soil. And so you can, again, track the signal power that you pick up from either antennas that are on the Earth or antennas on airplanes or in space, and really well-calibrated measurements of these of the signal powers will let you actually make maps of what the soil moisture content is over very large areas of the Earth. Maybe that's not the most ridiculous one, but okay. So I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to stop on that and kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about threats to GPS. So you hear about GPS threats a lot in the media, right? There's sort of two different things. The first is interference and jamming. So interference and jamming is when somebody is deliberately trying to make GPS hard to track. And so they will put out a signal that's in this frequency band where GPS is, and basically swamp it out in terms of power. The most common thing here is something called personal privacy devices, which are basically GPS jammers that you can buy illegally on the internet and plug in to your cigarette lighter in your car, and it basically jams GPS by putting out a very low signal, but just at the right frequency. Why would anybody want to do that? You guys would never think of this, but someone who's, doesn't want their boss to know where they're taking the company car, right? They jam the GPS so it can't track them. Or other nefarious things that you might be doing and you don't want someone to know where you are. So this is one of those things where people feel like GPS is watching you. GPS is not watching you because you're not transmitting a signal, you're just listening, right? So GPS is up there transmitting, you listen. But if you're driving the company car and it's listening and so it solves for position, but if it's connected to some other communication thing that's telling your boss where you are, well, that's the listening part, right? That's where the reporting is happening. So these GPS jammers have caused problems on highways and near airports where people drove cars with these jammers nearby, and then, yeah, it's not good. There's also unintentional but large-scale disruptions sometimes. There was a famous thing that happened in early 2022 in Denver. There was GPS interference that was near Denver International Airport, where there was a transmitter that was errantly transmitting near the GPS band for, 33 hours before they figured out where it was and shut it off. Okay, so that was bad. It didn't actually affect people on the ground very much. It mostly affected aircraft in that vicinity. So aircraft navigation systems that use GPS have a lot of integrity. They monitor carefully for interference like this, but so they did detect it. It was a problem. And then they did shut it off. And then there's high power jammers in areas of conflict. So in Syria, in Ukraine, there's various places the North Koreans put out a lot of jamming. So there's places where there's a lot of jamming being generated intentionally to try to cause problems. So what can you do about GPS jamming? So you can protect against the inadvertent jamming by protecting the GNSS spectrum. And there was a huge political rat's nest associated with the licensing of a company called Legato transmitting signals close to the GPS band. And this is highly controversial. Legato describes it as, GPS is too sensitive, but there's also things about it has to do with the spectrum band that it's allocated in and how much signal power they're putting out and how many transmitters they're putting out. So that's one of the big conflicts. It's difficult to resolve. It's how do you share spectrum in a way that's efficient, but also there's a big difference between using spectrum just for communication and using spectrum for positioning and for scientific purposes. So when you're communicating, all you need to do is get the bits correctly, right? You don't really care if they're a little bit delayed or a little bit distorted as long as you can extract them properly. But if you're trying to use those signals to actually precisely time the arrival of something, the shape of the spectrum, the shape of the signal and the actual alignment of it and how wide a bandwidth you can track makes a difference in the kinds of things you can achieve. If you're doing things like soil moisture detection, the amount of signal power that you pick up is really important. So if it varies because some other transmitter's nearby, it hurts you. So other things you can do in your receiver, you can actually detect that jamming is present because GPS signals are naturally very weak. So if suddenly you see a very strong thing, it's not real. It's not really GPS, right? So you can do that. And then you can also block the source of the interference. So if you're trying to position, if you can put any kind of a physical blockage in the way, a building, like go around a building, if there's a jammer on one side of the building, you go to the other, in most cases, you won't see it, right? The building surface is enough to block it. And then there's something called a SERPA antenna, controlled radiation pattern antennas. This is a very good way of rejecting high power signals. It turns out there's an export restriction on this, which is somewhat unnecessary, I think. And this is something that could help people a lot. The other big risk is in something called spoofing. So in jamming, somebody's just creating a signal that's interfering with you, intentionally or not. In spoofing, somebody's deliberately trying to make your receiver think it's in a different place, okay? This is also sometimes called a simulator, right? So if you're trying to test a receiver and you're designing it for space, you want to be able to test it before you go in space. So you have a signal simulator that you plug into your receiver so you can test to make sure all the algorithms work in your lab. But the problem is if you take something like a simulator and you transmit it out, then it will create signals that can fool receivers into thinking they're somewhere else. And so this is being used by Russia in the Black Sea area. They're putting out signals that make ships think they're going around in circles in a different place. It shows up mostly in maritime. Again, you can see where somebody might want to do this if they're fishing illegally, then they could make their receiver look like it's actually somewhere different, right? So they can deliberately spoof their own signals so that they don't get in trouble. So what can you do, to avoid being spoofed? So the good news is there's so many constellations out there. You can use lots of GPS signals to sort out what could possibly be happening, right? In order for a spoofer to spoof you, it has to fool all of the signals you're tracking. So if you track a lot of signals, different constellations, they would have to use a pretty sophisticated spoofer to make sure they got all of them. You can also kind of tell from, if there's a spoofer, it's not going to have transmitters all across the sky, right? So if you have an antenna that you can look in different parts of the sky separately, you can kind of tell the difference between whether you're being spoofed or not. And if somebody's spoofing you and all the people around you, you're all going to look like you're in the same place. So you can use your own diversity of position to determine that that's not happening, right? So there's smarts that can happen in a receiver to avoid spoofing as well. Okay. And then where are we going next? So one of the, I think, most interesting things that's happening, there's a bunch of interesting things. So more of the constellations are looking at diversifying, not just being in medium Earth orbit, but in low Earth orbit and higher orbits as well. There's a navigation test satellite that's being launched in later this year called NTS-3, and it's going to have a payload on board that will allow them to test all different kinds of different signals, really modernized signals. It'll be all software defined, and so that's going to be a really exciting test, and it's going to be a geostationary satellite that's going to be over the United States, and so we'll be able to see it here. There's also this interesting concept called signals of opportunity on the lower left here. What I've talked about today are constellations specifically for positioning and timing applications, but it turns out that if you can do that, you can actually start using satellites that weren't intended for that purpose. So people have figured out that, let's say Starlink and other ones, are transmitting signals regular enough that you could actually use them for navigation even without Elon charging you anything, right? So if you know what those patterns look like and you have some help from other receivers nearby, you can start to use TV transmissions and communication satellites and all kinds of other things. They're less reliable. Their timing isn't as great as GPS, but they give you signals all over the sky. And so this is a big area of interest right now. So the whole idea of using whatever is being transmitted at you, right? And if you put it all together into a giant filter, you can actually determine your position in a much more robust way. So that's pretty exciting. And then things like putting optical atomic clocks in space. Folks here in Jilla are building the world's most stable clocks. So they're looking at putting them in, not the ones that they have right now, but putting clocks in orbit like that, interconnecting them with the quantum network so that you can actually get time much more precisely and much more stably than we currently do. And that also will be, open up new things that nobody had thought of what you could do with yet. And then, of course, we have to figure out how to navigate in cislunar space because Artemis is going there. There are going to be more things going back and forth. So how are we going to navigate there? So I will stop. If you haven't done the tour before the lecture, up on the 4th floor, we have a model of the GPS-3 satellite. It was donated by Lockheed Martin. It's a 1/3 scale model, so it's worth taking the elevator up there to take a look at it. And yeah, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
So Penina, we have almost half an hour for discussion, which is fantastic. We could begin with, we've several questions online, and maybe while I read out one of those, we will have Gretchen available to bring the mic to folks in the room. So a participant named John has an anecdote plus a question. John says, thank you for this presentation. I helped carry Trimble GPS equipment to measure the Adirondacks in the mid-90s. At that time, it took several hours to get an accurate reading.
Yeah.
I would be interested to hear your opinion regarding the current GPS infrastructure and whether it can handle a likely future exponential growth of autonomous driving vehicles, or what might need to happen to enable that. Thank you.
Great question. I also worked with Trimble receivers in those days. And in those days, each channel was a board. Like you had to insert a board in these rack mounted things. So they're heavy and moving them around was tough. So in those days, it took a long time to do surveys because you had to calculate, you had to set up not only your own station, but reference stations. And the geometry for that was fairly weak. And so solutions took a really long time. So it does make sense that that's how it was. Nowadays, you can use the global infrastructure for the reference stations. You don't have to set your own thing up anymore. So that definitely simplifies the ability to do it. The infrastructure to deport, so the question was about supporting self-driving cars, right? Self-driving cars cannot depend on GPS alone, right? Because they need active sensing of the environment. They need to be able to see the cars in front of them. So they're going to have LiDAR or, something to track the vehicles besides just passively tracking GPS on each one. You need some kind of active sensor for self-driving cars. GPS will definitely help support it. It provides an absolute measurement. But because GPS is totally passive, you can support an infinite number of users. There's no limit to how many users can use it because it's just you're just receiving.
David, we have a question back here.
Please.
My name's Joe. My question is something like GPS being used on Mars to track the rovers, the helicopters, all that stuff?
That's a great question. GPS on Mars has been a very popular topic, right? Because when you want to go explore, we are so used to having GPS available that it'd be nice to think of it there. The problem is it takes a lot of satellites to be able to provide coverage. So the answer is no, there isn't anything like that at Mars. And when JPL and other people have looked at, is it worth creating a GPS for Mars or an Mars positioning system, right? They're talking about that for the moon as well, right? So it's expensive because you have to get them all the way there. The satellites themselves have to know where they are. So until you have a big presence of vehicles and people and whatever needing it on Mars, it's probably not the most efficient way to support navigation on Mars. So what you can do though is build up a sort of bootstrap it, right? So if every orbiter that goes to Mars can act also like a navigation satellite system, right? A signal of opportunity, then as more vehicles go there and as more platforms go there, you can sort of organically grow a future capability. But I think initially they're more likely to be ground-based geolocation. So you would put transmitters on the ground. They're sometimes called pseudo-lights that would let you position in that vicinity. And you can, of course, do positioning and measurements all the way from the Earth with a deep space network. There's a question over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned several of the other systems, the Soviet and Russian GLONASS, I think Beidou from China and Galileo. So some of the newer systems would have an advantage of being able to pursue like a clean slate design, for the lack of a better word. What sort of use cases and applications would they have in mind potentially, that things that maybe would be difficult to do or more difficult to do for GPS with its legacy that, of course, it has to support? That's
a great question. One of the most obvious ones, I think, has to do with the update rate. So, for example, the Galileo satellites update. So in order to do positioning, we sort of glossed over this, but in order to position yourself using a transmitter, you have to know where the transmitter was, right, when it sent the signal. So that information is encoded in the signals we get. GPS, the way GPS sends that information to us is they upload it once a day roughly, and it sends messages that are good for the whole next day. Galileo updates those messages every 15 minutes. So it allows them to be more precise than if you have to predict them ahead for a day. In most cases, it's not game-changing, it's not a big deal, but that's one of the differences. One of the other things that they have with Beidou is they have, in addition to normal GPS, they do have the ability to send signals up to the satellite. So they can use some two-way measurements. They can do measurements to the satellites as well as just the passive measurements. You can also use different signal constructs allow you to be more resistant to jamming and interference. And so being able to refresh and implement new signal structures or new types of codes can also be beneficial for that.
Perhaps we could get one from this side of the room and then we'll go to an online question.
Hi.
Hi.
Is anybody using GPS to try to document at a global level the rising sea level due to global warming?
Yeah, absolutely. So the GRACE mission definitely is doing that. So GRACE is there's GRACE and there's the altimetry sequence. I don't have a picture of it here, but NASA has a whole NASA and ESA have a whole sequence of altimeters. Let me go back to that slide actually. This sequence of missions, starting with TOPEX, which is down here, right? Yeah, TOPEX 1992. There's this whole record all the way from 1992 to today. This is Sentinel-6B is, sorry, this is the one that's currently operating. Sentinel-6 Michael Freilich is up there now. Sentinel-6 2025. There's a whole sequence of these missions that are making these measurements directly from space. So GPS is used for the orbits and the altimeters are used to measure the sea height. And if you go to the website for this sealevel.colorado.edu, they have all that information.
Nita, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, apologies if not. Nita is wondering, can anyone have a license to transmit signals in the GPS frequency? For example, in ham radio, we need to have license to transmit in some frequencies.
No, you're not allowed to. So no one is allowed to transmit except for the assigned constellations. So every one of the constellations that we talked about that I mentioned is licensed to transmit in those bands, and there are no other things allowed to be used in those bands.
Great. Another maybe quick informational question from Eric. Does GNSS tie into NASA's Deep Space Network, or DSN, or other astronomical observatories?
It doesn't tie in directly. I think that the DSN stations probably use GPS for timing, but there's no interdependence the other way. So GPS doesn't depend on the Deep Space Network, but I would expect the Deep Space Network probably uses GPS for time synchronization across their stations.
Thank you. So omitting classified military applications, what's the current accuracy of GPS? And then what is it that limits that accuracy? And then third, despite your hesitance to speak about the future, what could we do if the accuracy were 10 times better?
That's a great question, but it's not an easy question to answer. So if you take a GPS standalone position, so if you go out in the middle of nowhere with just your GPS and no cell phone access, no nothing else, you can get positioned down to about a meter, okay? Nowadays, it's not guaranteed to a meter, but practically speaking, most of the time it does about a meter to 3 meters, something like that. If you know you're standing still, you can average over time. It'll get better than that. Yeah, right? If you use correction services, so there's a thing called the wide area differential system. There are other differential correction services. You can get your position down to 0.3 of a meter if you have these correction services available. Then there's this thing called PPP, precise point positioning, or RTK, real-time kinematic, where not only do you use these code measurements, but you actually use carrier measurements too, okay? With carrier measurements and information from IGS, right, you can get your solutions down to 10 centimeters in most places, not your cell phone. Your cell phone doesn't have a good enough antenna for that. So then you asked me about, so depending on how you're using it, whether it's in real time or post-processing, right? If it's a science thing you don't need to know right now, you want to know where you were at some other time. So I would say real-time positioning is somewhere between 10 centimeters to several meters in most applications. Vertical tends to be worse, so your horizontal position's better. But then for science applications, you can, depending on what you're doing, you can get centimeter level. You can do orbits now 5 centimeters, 1 centimeter, something like that. Okay. So what limits it? If you're in an environment with, let's say in an urban environment, you'll probably have worse results for a few reasons. One is the sky can be blocked by buildings. And if you get a bunch of reflections in from buildings, you won't have that nice distributed geometry. That's probably the biggest limiting factor in sort of practical people walking around with cell phones. In cell phones too, the antenna is really bad. So it tends to pick up reflections really well, which is kind of good, but also kind of bad, because when you have a reflection, you're not getting that direct signal from the satellite, so you don't know the path. But people like Google's working on this thing where they integrate like the city environment, and they actually model all the reflected paths coming off of buildings, and they can do some improvement. But you probably can't get below meter, maybe not below meter level there. So I think you're asking me because you want to know if quantum or optical clocks can make a big difference. Oh, when you're running, you mean? It's probably right. Sorry. But if it's, yeah. Yeah, so people are interested in, what can you do with better clocks, right? And are there applications of quantum to these future systems? What it really allows you to do is have greater robustness. So if someone's trying to spoof you and you know for sure your clock doesn't wander around like that, it gives you a lot of robustness against something like that. And it also allows you to predict out farther forward into the future, right? So with the current clocks, deviate by a few nanoseconds a day. So if you have a clock that doesn't deviate much for a week, you can predict it, a week with better accuracy. And that means you need less information coming from the satellites. You can also use it for other scientific purposes too. So for just normal navigating around, I would say it's mainly the improvement in resilience. But for improving science, there's no end to what you could do. Everybody always wants better accuracy.
Great. Another question in the room? Down front here, Ariel.
We're approaching the solar peak activity, and that's supposed to affect radio signals. So
Yeah.
how is that affecting the GPS system?
That's a great question. And people in space weather, do talk about this a lot, right? Like, these cataclysmic things that could happen, right? So there are two aspects. One, people are somewhat concerned about how space weather events could actually damage satellites in orbit. And that's one issue, right? Because the satellites in orbit, their electronics and other components could be sensitive to increases in high energy particles. One of the interesting things actually about the orbits that the GPS and the GLONASS satellites are in is that they're actually within the Van Allen belts. So they live in a very difficult electromagnetic environment, right? So the early GPS satellites were having failures of the solar panels, and the clocks were actually suffering. So the GPS satellites, each GPS satellite actually carries 3 or 4 clocks on board, because without the good clock on board, it's useless. So they wanted to have enough of them to provide replacements without having to launch another satellite. So the GPS and the GLONASS and the Galileo satellites tend to be pretty radiation hard because of that, right? So they most likely will be less sensitive to space weather events themselves than other satellites that aren't operating in that environment, don't necessarily have to worry about it normally. Okay, so now the signal effect, right? So as the signals travel through the ionosphere, they can be affected by those things. And if you're in a part of the world, let's say an equatorial region where the ionosphere tends to be more active, you can see more effects, more scintillation effects. So what that means is the signal is fading in and out in terms of how strong it is and also what the delay looks like. It can be difficult for a receiver to track it. The good news is that scintillation actually affects different frequencies slightly differently. So because each of the satellites is transmitting several frequencies, GPS is sending 3 different ones right now. Each one of those will scintillate or fade slightly out of sync with the others. So if you design a receiver to tolerate that, to be aware of that, you can actually get through it pretty decently. And there's a professor in my department, Jade Morton, whose group actually has been working specifically on this problem of designing receivers to be resilient to fading under solar conditions like that. Now, will the receiver chip inside your phone have trouble? Maybe, right? But there is the ability to design receivers to do it because there is this diversity of frequencies that's happening. The other thing that happens is even when there are space weather events in mid-latitudes, there's usually not that dramatic an effect, right? And it wouldn't be, it's not, from my understanding, it's not typically uniform across the whole sky. So if you have some satellites in a part of the sky, let's say towards where the sun is, you might have more activity in that region. And then the signals that are coming from other directions might be completely unaffected by it. So it's something to be aware of. And the normal, just sort of elevated level of electron content is handled automatically through this multiple frequency calibration that's done in the receiver.
Yeah, over here.
Hi, I read that the number of satellites in low Earth orbit was going to increase by an order of magnitude by
Yeah.
2030.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if that is dense enough in low Earth orbit to create a problem for GPS.
Oh, you mean, do they get in the way or? of
Yeah.
it? Yeah, no, it's totally fine. Like there's no, the likelihood of signals like reflecting off or being blocked by that is not a problem that you have to worry about. You probably have to worry about space debris more than anything else, right? That's a problem, but yeah. No, fortunately the signals, you know, when you see those pictures that show space really crowded, the satellite images are not to scale, right? So the satellites look really big, like they're blocking the whole sky, but it's not going to block the signals. Other questions?
So let's, there's a couple more online.
Yeah.
Nita, who I mentioned earlier, just wanted to add that they'll be joining the PhD program in fall 2023 under Professor Jade Morton, who you just mentioned.
Good choice, yeah.
And that's kind of a nice segue to another question from Donna. If a student was interested in studying GPS or working in industry with GPS, what academic training would you recommend?
That's a good question. So there are a number of schools around the country that have programs focused in GPS. We are definitely one of the best ones, I think. In a lot of schools, it's kind of interesting because it's such a diverse subject. So in a lot of schools, it'll be in the electrical engineering department, but it also has this sort of strong connection to aerospace because it's the connection between orbits as well as all the electronics. So I would look at electrical engineering programs as well as aerospace programs. And then GPS is also really big in geophysics programs, right? Because they use it for all the geophysics applications. One of the well, this is a CU thing, right? So we can be a little bit biased, right? CU has a really strong program in geophysics. The work on ice sheets and all that was done in that department. John Warr, who was in the physics department, Christine Larson, it's like crosses through so many different departments here. And other schools have programs. They tend to be narrower. There are very few places that have such a broad impact across so many different departments as we do here. And Neil Ashby in physics is the leading expert on relativistic effects on GPS. He wrote the thing on that. So yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Looks like Gretchen, there's, oh, yep, that'll work.
Hi, I'm Paul. What kind of accuracies are they seeing using computations like off of Starlink satellites? And
Well, they're kind of vague right now. They're
too early?
Yeah, it's a little early. I saw, so there's a guy named Zach Cassis who's been leading that effort mainly, and also University of Texas. So Todd Humphreys is a guy down there. I think they're in the 10-meter range positioning. The challenge is you have to go back and estimate the orbit of the transmitter because they're not telling you it, right? So when you need ground stations to figure that out. And so I think it's in the 10-ish meter range, which isn't bad considering, right? I'm guessing they'll get there. There was a question right next to you.
In terms of integrating whatever the clock data is on the device you're using
Yeah.
versus the clock info from the satellites, if you have like no clock
Yeah.
on your device, how can you combine data from enough satellites to actually get a time without having any time reference locally?
No, so there are two things, right? Each of the transmitters has to have a decent clock on board because it has to tell you what its clock error is, right? So when the GPS satellite is transmitting a signal, it also sends a message that says, hey, my clock is off by 10 nanoseconds or a microsecond. That's determined by the control segment. So the control segment figures that out by tracking the satellites all over the world and then uploading that information to the satellites, then they send it back to you, right? So you can't use a transmitter for which you don't know the clock error. The receiver has to have some kind of timing device. It doesn't have to be very accurate though. It can be a really cheap little chip. It's a TCXO, a temperature controlled oscillator works okay. And it just has to measure all the things simultaneously and then it can instantly estimate its clock error. So the satellite transmitters have to have decently stable clocks. The receiver also decently stable, but the decent doesn't have to be as good, right, on the receiver side, but it has to have a way of making a timing measurement. In the signals of opportunity case, though, you're now saying, okay, if I have a station and then there's a bunch of other stations around, we all track the Starlink satellites, we can work together to not only estimate where we are, but then also estimate where the Starlink satellites are. So there's a little bit of bootstrapping that is going to happen in those kind of solutions. Did that answer your question?
So another pair of questions online, I
Yeah.
think, have to do with which networks are available to different devices, if there's differences. An anonymous attendee asks if their old Garmin GPS tracks all satellites or just the US ones, and is there any advantage to using the old GPS instead of our phones? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, so let me go back to the constellation picture here. So in terms of licensing, you know, there's all phones right now use GPS. So when you have a cell phone chip in, you know, a GPS chip in your cell phone, right now, I think they all use GPS as the starting point, and then they go from there. In China, they have phones that require Beidou, right? You have to, they use Beidou first, and then maybe they use the other ones. If you have an old GPS device, like an old Garmin, it probably isn't tracking all the different constellations. It's probably just tracking GPS. But the good news is the legacy signals are still there. So you probably can still use your old Garmin. But newer ones do tend to have multiple constellations. So, you know, actually, if you have an Android phone, there's a cool app for the Android phone called GPS Test, which is free. And it'll show you what satellites your phone is using. Okay. If you have an iPhone, you're out of luck because Apple so far has refused to show what it's doing. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah, so Apple phones, we keep trying to convince them that they should put a simple, you know, display up that will show you what they're doing, but so far they've decided that customers are not interested. Yeah.
If you have an Apple phone, there's an app called GNSS View.
Oh, when it
And-
shows it now?
Yeah.
Yay, okay, cool.
You can also turn them on and off
Yeah.
individually so you can see which is where.
Yeah, and so you can it's probably the same then as on the Android, because on my Android phone, you can tell your phone to only use some of them, right? So you can actually tell it not to use some constellations if you want to. I actually kind of had trouble with that by accident because I turned off GPS and then couldn't get it back on for a while. But that's, yeah, that's cool. I have to change my story on that. What's it called again? GPS View, GNSS. Oh, that's really exciting.
Great, and we've got time for maybe one or two more questions.
So I've been very happy with GPS being a passive system,
Yeah,
but you mentioned 18 to 20-year-olds uploading data constantly.
Yeah.
If we wipe out the 18 to 20-year-olds, do we lose our ability to navigate?
no, in fact, the 18 to 20-year-olds are sitting in a, you know, secure area. They don't upload it very frequently. So the satellites are tracked all over the world, right? They only upload once a day it's basically a prediction ahead for what the orbit and clock of the satellite's going to do the next day, right? So it's not urgent. The satellites actually, and this is a Cold War era thing, the satellites are designed to operate for 180 days without ground control. So the accuracy will probably degrade over some amount during that time. And we've never tested it as far as I know, right? They do upload them every day. But they are designed with longer term ephemeris. And so, yeah. And there's also a backup station too. There is a backup control segment. Okay. I'm sorry, I thought that I was running short on time before.
It's perfect.
For the ground stations,
Yeah.
the map, are there GPS ground stations in China and Russia?
Oh, good question. So there are two types of ground stations. The control segment, the US control segment that actually creates, let me see if I can get it here. Oh, I don't have it, sorry. This is the best I got. So the stations that monitor the GPS satellites on behalf of the US military, are not located in those countries. They're mostly located at Air Force stations around the world. So there's these islands, there's Kwajalein, Diego Garcia. I don't remember the whole list of them. The National Geospatial Agency operates all the control stations that are used for determining the orbits and clocks as part of the official products that get uploaded to the satellites. So GPS doesn't depend on anything like that, but they do have stations all over the world in ally countries, okay? The network that I showed you, the IGS, which is not used in real time. So this doesn't affect the operation of any of the, it doesn't affect the operation of any of the satellite systems themselves. These are just sites that gather data and post it on the internet, right? So there are stations all over the world here, definitely lots of them in China. China is very active in IGS. And so they have a huge number of researchers collecting data for all kinds of things. And so you can get data from stations in Russia and China from IGS, but they're not at all used as part of the uplink thing. And I expect that the other countries, when they run their systems, also don't depend on ground stations that are in, you know, non-ally countries.
And the reverse question,
Yes.
because Beidou and GLONASS now exist, where do they locate their control segments?
Well, so the control segment is probably in their home country, but the monitoring sites, like where are their monitoring sites? I know that Russia at one time didn't have too many monitoring sites that weren't in their sphere. And as a result, their orbit estimates weren't that accurate, right? Because you can estimate an orbit without seeing the satellite all over the world. It's just not as good, right? And so they have expanded. So they do have sites in different places. I don't have a map of, I don't know off the top of my head. Same thing with China. In the early versions of the Beidou system, all of their tracking was done from the Chinese region, China region. And now they do have stations also in other locations. I don't know if any of them are actually in the US. There was some discussion about there isn't one? Yeah, okay, good to know. Yeah, it's not necessary, right? You can do it without it, so. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're out
Yeah.
of time for discussion. Would you be interested in leaving us with sort of a concise sense of, you know, given the presentation and the discussion that's happened, what would you want folks to take away from your presentation if they have anything that's really memorable?
That's a good question. Hopefully the sense of just how cool and impactful it is, right? All the different things that have been done with it. Hopefully it's a little bit less of a black box to you, right? That you understand what it's doing and how that kind of works. And if you think of any questions later, just get in touch with me. I'm happy to answer them. So really appreciate all the great questions and your patience and coming over. And if you have time to go see the building, definitely take a tour. We have a couple students who are in my sophomore dynamics class who volunteered to come and give tours, and at least go up to the 4th floor and take a look at the GPS satellite.
All right, excellent. Everyone, please join me in thanking Professor Axelrad. Thank you so much. And there's a few sort of logistical and informational things here for closing that I'll provide for everyone. Thanks to everyone who joined today online as well as in person. All the great questions. We didn't get to several of those online questions. We hope that you'll join us for future events and we'll have a chance to engage again. Oh yeah, thank you. If you're here in person and haven't toured the building, please do take advantage of that. Let's actually have some applause to appreciate those students who came in on a Saturday afternoon. Non-standard. You can tell that Penny has some real pull with her students when you see that happening. So not surprising when you see that I think a very, very gifted teacher as well as a researcher. And I just think this is such a great example of the intersection of our research and public service missions. Professor Axelrad being willing to share her expertise with all of us today. We're really, really grateful for her time and helping us troubleshoot some of the tech things, doing these events hybrid. You can see that we're still figuring out how to do that well. We appreciate everyone's patience and bearing with as we try to make sure that we can include everyone. So I would like to appreciate the Office for Outreach and Engagement staff, Gretchen and Ariel and Annabelle and Lisa Schwartz, who some of you might have met out front. They help make all of this programming possible. I'm lucky to get to work with each of those folks. This is our last See You on the Weekend lecture of the Spring 2023 series, but we hope you will join us next fall and join our colleagues also for the Research and Innovation Office for 2 upcoming April lectures. There are flyers about that on the table at the hall. Those lectures are going to be really fantastic. And we would also like to invite you to join us for a presentation at the CU Natural History Museum on April 20th from noon to 1 p.m. Lisa, let me know if I'm getting this wrong. That's correct. So we have some artists and some scientists, artists from around the state of Colorado, who have partnered through this program with CU scientists to create art that is about the science that's being done in relation to environmental, I think particularly climate change issues. And they'll be presenting on that collaboration experience, as well as sharing about some of the products that are coming out of that. So that's again on April 20th, the Natural History Museum. We hope to see many of you there. And finally, on your screen, or for those of you who are in the room up here, you'll see a QR code that if you have a smartphone, in addition to the Google Maps and your GPS functionality, you can also scan a QR code. And that will take you to a survey where you can provide us feedback on this event, make suggestions for other research topics you'd like to see addressed in the future. And we take all that feedback into account when we're planning for future events. So please participate in that. If you prefer to do a paper survey, if you're here in person, you can find those at the, oh yeah, Annabelle has those up there. So grab a paper survey from Annabelle if you prefer that method. So I think that's everything. Am I missing anything important? No, great. Well, thank you all again. We hope you have a wonderful remainder of the spring and summer, and we'll see you on the weekend again in the fall. Have a wonderful day.